All right, welcome back to Talking Shop, episode 6. Today, we're fortunate enough to have two experts in the mental health world for sports psychology specifically. So I'm just going to get them to quickly introduce themselves, and then we'll get into some questions for them. So go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, hello, I'm Nicolas Allen with Human Integrated Performance. I'm a registered psychologist here in Edmonton. I've been working with athletes being a former athlete myself, I've been working in the athletic world for over 20 years now. So, I've been working as a sports psychologist since 2009 and working both general populations as well as athletes, and run a multidisciplinary clinic called Human Integrated Performance.
Perfect. Ryan, go ahead.
Hey, my name is Ryan Guenter. I work as a mental performance consultant at Pivotal Physiotherapy out of a couple of their offices. My background is really all in team sports. I played a little college baseball, played hockey at the University of Lethbridge, and then went back to school later on to the U of A to do my master's degree. And I also scout, so part of my mental performance consulting has to do a little bit with talent identification. I worked for the Victoria Royals for a long time, and now with the Winnipeg Ice. So thanks for having me, Brian.
Perfect. Thanks for hopping on, guys. So the first thing I just want to run by you guys, I know it's a bit of a touch and go area. Like, at what point in time should players beginning to think about actually including sports psychology in part of their day-to-day routine?
Yeah, I'll jump in first on this one. I've worked with lots of young athletes, and I don't think it's less of the question for me is less of when we actually start, but how we actually start. So I've had youth athletes, and I've age-specific tools for athletes that are as young as 8 and 9 years old. So we can start doing some of those foundational mental skills really early, but the intensity and the detail that we're going to go into some of those skills with an 8 and 9 year old is going to be very different than an 18 and 19 year old. So I think the sooner we can start engaging some of those tools, and whether it be just by coaches integrating something or by parents integrating something, it doesn't have to be meeting with a sports psychologist or a mental skills trainer specifically, but by incorporating some of those skills sooner, it's just laying a foundation for those athletes to be strong, healthy athletes for the rest of their career.
Perfect.
Yeah, no, I think just in terms of what Nicholas alluded to, it's got to be age appropriate, of course. Some of the things that I took out of my research at the U of A, I feel like the younger the better. So 8 is probably the beginning point, just to talk about things like how important compete is, and that general work ethic, but team, like really emphasizing the team and leadership and how important those things are. Again, they can be age specific, but really effective. And then they build a foundation from there in terms of, as Nick alluded to, the intensity and volume, if you will, right?
Yeah, and I find even young athletes, they can really excel well when doing some basic goal setting for themselves. They know something they want to sort of strive towards, and even some really basic visualization work really well, because they're always a very imaginative group already. So by just giving them a little bit more structure to that imagination of theirs, and leading a little bit more of a visualization approach, can be super powerful for them. And even because they don't necessarily have the cognitive abilities to manage some of those emotions, giving them just some basic physiological tools to manage their stress, whether it be breathing techniques or some simple relaxation tools, can be super helpful. And we see, young kids will go to a play therapist, right, for mental health issues, right? The same sort of tools can be used and applied for a lot of youth athletes as well.
So do you think it just kind of comes down to, I guess, an athlete's mental preparedness themselves to actually want to begin doing it? Is that kind of part of what you would suggest as well?
Yeah, Ryan, if you want to go ahead first, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a big element to it in that the athlete themselves has to be open to it and realize that it's a proactive thing and not a reactive thing. Like, the stigma around using some mental performance or sports psychology is that there's an issue, but that's not necessarily the case. It can be very proactive and kind of getting that message to young athletes. I think is important to kind of eliminate that stigma, right?
Yeah, and I think, just introducing it in ways that's fun. And And as far as Ryan was alluding to, just naturalizing it for them so that there's not this stigma around it. It's not this weird, really weird thing, that it's just something they can incorporate in general. And, again, sort of long-term athlete development program, if we just start, again, as we said before, if we're making age appropriate, they're just foundational skills that these athletes can build on, regardless of what sport they're doing. So even if they're starting in, in atom or in hockey or in soccer, it doesn't really matter what sport they're doing, because these skills, if they're introduced properly, they can be applied across the board in any sport, right?
I know too, like from my standpoint, you think about like every time you hear a coach is always like, oh, the player needs to work on their skating, they need to work on their shot, they need to work on this. But I'm starting to hear more people say that the player needs to work on the mental aspect of their game. Like their confidence is really low. They struggle with, all that aspect that you don't really used to never hear that, right? Now it's becoming something more common that GMs and coaches are even talking about with their players.
And that's definitely one of the things I see most often with youth athletes. The two biggest things I would say is that confidence piece. So and because of that lack of confidence, they've either developed some competitive anxiety or just performance anxiety that started to develop. So that confidence piece and communication, understanding how to communicate with coaches that might be a little bit more intense, a little bit louder, being able to have some of those skills and not to absorb that critique as a negative for them, but to really find ways to utilize and to develop their skills rather than feeling like they're being put down all the time.
Perfect.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the issues that seem to come up nowadays they are performance related, but they start somewhere else, right? So just trying to address that again proactively, and hey, what is affecting the on-ice performance? I think that's a big thing to try and tackle. So.
And I think a huge way to tackle all these problems is to get coaches of young athletes to find some ways to integrate these tools in, right? Adding in a relaxation exercise as part of warm-up, right? Or a visualization drill as part of practice. Like some easy ways that normalize it for the athlete. They learn to utilize these skills and it doesn't have a negative impact. I mean, I think it's far less likely to have an impact or to be useful for the athlete when they're 8 or 9 years old coming in to see a psychologist or a mental skills trainer than for the coaches to be having those sessions and trying to apply some of those skills, or bringing a professional in and working with that team a little bit can be, I think, far more productive because it just normalizes it more rather than they're having to go see this stranger and there's a problem that they have to go and fix or things along those lines. I think coaches can integrate as part of that process. It's amazing the difference that can have, and again, bring the team together as well.
Just that rapport too, right? That's a key with everything at the end of the day, right? So if players are sitting at home, I mean, pretty much everyone I talk to is doing the same thing, trying to find something to keep themselves occupied. So there's some things that you guys might recommend that players could easily find and track down, even if it's on the internet or wherever they can find it, that they could start if they've never experienced or done anything in the sports psychology kind of realm?
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Ryan.
Okay. I think even Nick mentioned a couple right off the bat. I think this is a perfect time, although we don't know specific time frames, it's a really good time to revisit some of the goals and goal setting that you might have. And just looking at more of the kind of how you're going to achieve those goals, right, at this specific time, because, in whatever sport you're playing, you don't know timelines, right? But really kind of coming up with a strict to-do list or kind of a reminder every day of what you're trying to accomplish. Nick also mentioned some relaxation, some self-talk, and all those things take a lot of practice, right? So it's a perfect opportunity with some downtime to really work on some of those things, right?
Yes, I think it's very similar to when athletes have an injury and they're not able to play. That there's an opportunity now to work on things that you wouldn't normally have time to work on. And so although maybe your physical skills, your technical skills may not be improving as much as you'd want them to right now, those mental skills, those relaxation skills, they can really catch up to everything else right now. So it's a perfect time. I think. Ryan alluded to this idea of the how, right? I always talk about with my athletes this idea of process versus performance goals or outcome goals, and focus on that process of how you're going to achieve something and what are the steps to get you there. Although we don't have a time frame, you can still work on improving your certain skills in the meantime, and focus on those things that you can control can really have a huge impact on how you handle and deal with the stress of this COVID-19 pandemic, right? And I fully agree with Ryan that I think visualization is a fantastic thing to really include. And it does take time to develop these skills, like something like a breathing skill. So many athletes, they learn a breathing skill and they expect it to work, the first time they do it. And it just doesn't work that way. Like our body takes time to learn how that relaxation skill is going to actually impact the body and how it's going to actually apply. So if we're not practicing on a regular basis when we don't need it, then when we come to those situations where there is a lot of stress and we're back playing and we're back at, in competition, well, that skill may not apply if we haven't practiced it during this time. So this is really for athletes is an opportunity to really build up some of that, those mental skills they don't normally have time or the focus to build on. And I'm a huge believer of visualization. So I think for me, the single most important skill that I would have athletes working on right now is incorporating some visualization into their training.
Plus that way they might feel like they're back at the rink.
Well, yeah. And the more they can make that realism and they can incorporate all their sort of their senses into that visualization, the more vivid it becomes. It's it'll get that brain stimulation going. We know that athletes that incorporate visualization into their strength training programs have better improvements in their strength than strength training alone. We know that athletes that incorporate visualization into their technical skills training will have better improvements than just technical skills alone. So by incorporating these skills now, you're just gonna be so much farther ahead of other athletes when everything gets back going. If you're not doing it right now, your opponent probably is. And so you want to use these times as effectively and efficiently as possible without creating extra stress for yourself during this difficult time.
Just kind of, I know you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I mean, obviously just the mental health of everyone right now, we're all kind of in a very, I guess, strange place, right? So do you think, I mean, for the general population, as well as these players that are missing being at the rink or being at the soccer field, do you think these same skills that you're talking about could also kind of translate towards just your general overall health and well-being?
Yeah, I don't think any of these things are harmful for anybody to be doing. I think one of the biggest things during this time is sort of someone needs to feel like they're getting some fulfillment. So whatever you're doing an activity, there needs to be something that's fulfilling by that. And that's one of the hardest things that I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really sucked away from people, is this idea of doing activities that give them fulfillment. A sense of accomplishment, I think, is also really important. And so when we can't achieve our goals, we can't work to, the strength gains that we were hoping to get or the off-ice stuff we were hoping to get to, that sense of accomplishment can go away. So incorporating those mental skills is one way to recreate that sense of accomplishment. And then just, this idea of, we have accomplishment, we have, and fun and relaxation, enjoyment becomes so important. If we don't have that way of creating that enjoyment, then it's really hard. And that's, not knowing when things are going to end and the boredom that a lot of people have experienced with this. If we're not creative to find some ways to create some enjoyment, it really becomes difficult to get through this. So along with these mental skills, trying to incorporate those three things, I think are utterly really important for everybody.
Perfect. Ryan?
Yeah, I guess, for me at these times with the anxiety, just not about sport, but everything, right? I think there's a certain element to that. And I'm always, never mind my studies or the practice, I'm a firm believer in that your thoughts become your reality, right? And your thoughts kind of are generated from your self-talk. So again, both Nick and I mentioned that these skills don't, like, whether it's breathing, goal setting, whatever the case is, they take practice, right? So there's a number of self-talk guidelines and just really quick tools to first of all be aware of that negative self-talk creeping in, but also just to have a few quick strategies to quickly reframe or whatever the case might be. That self-talk can be really destructive at times like this, just like it can be in sport, right? And to work on generating some positive self-talk. If you want a positive future, you want positive thoughts, right? It's kind of a sequential thing. So just, I think there's probably a lot of stuff online that players could look up in terms of self-talk or talk to Nick and I about some strategies, really quick strategies to help in that department to really, just stay as positive as you can, as hokey as that sounds. It's a reality right now in the situation that we're all in, right?
So does that mean when I get out golfing and I look at that 6-foot putt that I've missed every time and I go, I haven't made a 6-foot putt all day, and then I miss the next one still? Is that part of the issue, do you think?
Yeah, well, you need to talk yourself into it.
Maybe it's that I only golf twice a year. That could also be part of it.
And I think also there's this idea that I've lost my train of thought, but as Ryan was saying, like you know, the one thing nice about like psychology and mental skills training is that it's really translatable to doing more of the virtual sessions, where something like chiro or physio, it's not quite as easy because it's those professions and even training, there's so much more hands-on. Like, yes, you can have the trainer sort of giving you the exercises and calling out to you from the virtual section, but it's just not quite sometimes you need that hands-on correction to make the real change. Whereas from a mental skills perspective, it all has a conversation anyways. And so as long as we can email some of the worksheets or the handouts back and forth, it really translates well to doing an online sort of tool for a lot of people. And so not only athletes, but I think you'll find that even like business professionals that are struggling with their self-talk and their anxiety about business and about finances and the outcome of all this, you know, these same skills can help business professionals as well. The actual performance psychology for a business professional, the tools are no different, whether they're an 8-year-old athlete, a 19-year-old athlete, or a 55-year-old business professional. We can use the same skills for all these different avenues.
I think like even, sorry, you go ahead, Brian.
No, I was going to ask the next question. If you want to add, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think just getting back to self-talk for stuff, like Nick said, for performance, business or athletics or whatever, it's really, there's lots of evidence to suggest that it works. And like 20 years ago when we all played, you might be a little younger, Brian, but yeah, anyways, if you use the term self-talk back then, you know, you might be labeled as nutty or crazy or whatever, but the fact is we all have that internal dialogue. So to be able to work on that and feed off that in a good way, especially during challenging times like this, is hopefully will really help athletes going forward. And I don't work with many business professionals, but I'm sure Nick is probably guiding them in that same way to reduce some of these anxieties that are all driven through our internal dialogue for the most part.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things it's such a key important, you know, self-talk is such a key and important component of resiliency for people, right? And I think the one thing I always like to stress with self-talk is I think it's really important to be honest with yourself and not just give yourself platitudes. You know, sometimes they can say, "Oh, I'm a great player," but if you don't believe that you're a great player, sometimes having that self-talk may not always be the most useful. It's really about indicating to yourself what you need to do to be that really great player, or what you need to focus on that's going to help you be successful, rather than just sort of saying, "Oh, you know, everything's going to get better." Because if you don't believe it's going to get better, it's the same thing. If I say to you, "Don't think about a piece of paper," what's the first thing you think about, Brian?
So you cut out
probably a piece of paper.
Yeah.
Oh, so yeah, you're lucked out then, right? But if you say don't think about a piece of paper, that's the first thing that we generally think about. And so if we're telling ourselves something we don't really believe, we're actually going to make that a little bit more. We get more fixated on it. So make sure you're telling yourself stuff that you can have a little more control over. You can have an impact on, that will have a positive impact on your behaviors as well as your thoughts, because it's those behaviors that we can control. That's ultimately going to have a big change on that self-talk, because it is like Ryan said, that it's such an important tool that if it's neglected, we don't even realize how destructive it can be.
I was gonna, just in terms of like a final question for you guys, Nick's, your background, I know what your background is, and your obviously background is in hockey, so you're coming from a team sport, and Nick is kind of more in fencing, was more of an individualized sport. So is there a bit of a difference between kind of the dynamic of how that sports psychology can work within the team setting versus the individual setting?
You know, from my experience, I definitely think there's I think what I've noticed is rather than the actual tools, the same, right? I think what's bigger is, again, you said this earlier, Brian, was that the rapport is really key. I think in depending on how the professional brings it forward, developing that rapport with the individual athlete can be a lot easier, because there's less cultural things that you have to deal with. Whereas with a team, you know, if you're doing a team presentation or you're trying to teach the team these skills, well, there's multiple dynamics you have to deal with there and sort of take into account. So I think instituting and getting buy-in in a team setting, I think can be a little more challenging, not impossible by any means. Sometimes in some ways, if you have the leadership and the coach's body, and it can be an easier situation than with an individual athlete who's only there because their parents made them to be there. But I think that would be one of the different things that I notice. I think on the ice, and Ryan, you might be able to lose a little bit more of this. I think, if we look at hockey, for example, how some of those skills get applied on the ice when there is those multiple dynamics of your teammates and referees and the crowd and all this sort of stuff. Although individual sports may have some of that, they don't have the interaction with your teammates that a team sport has, and that can really impact how your nerves get impacted, how you remember to apply some of those skills. The ability to apply some of those skills can be quite challenging as well.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it can go both ways. One in that the game it's so X's and O's now and complicated, but as an individual in a team sport and having to keep those relationships and all the different dynamics in check in a game, I try and focus on those process goals for people really locked into whether it's confidence or their role or whatever the case is really trying to simplify things in game because you practice it, the systems, that. So just identify some really simple process goals that will lead to effective play, right? So not, for someone looking at offensive output, it's not about the actual outcome and how many apples and how many tucks you had, right? It's more about how you're going to do that, right? And then the other thing I find is looking at the dynamics of the junior level or the NHL level. I think everyone wants to be Ovechkin or Crosby or McDavid or whatever, but the value of hockey players specifically today is in those role play, role bottom six, 5-6 D-man, whatever the case is. Those are really valuable. So I know everyone gets jaded by not being on the power play or not being on the first couple units or whatever. But really, it goes back to those leadership skills and putting the team first, right, in a lot of situations. And that makes you more valuable a lot of times. So as far as a team game, don't ask what the team's going to do for you. What can I do for the team? A lot of times is the best answer, right? And if you want a long career, sometimes it just comes down to being willing to play those roles. You can play 15 years, and 15 years at $700,000, the NHL minimum salary right now. I would take that.
Pretty good money.
Yeah. Taking a little bit of a different tangent, I would, going back to this idea of the individual versus the team. One of the things I think is really interesting with the team sports, I would say that if we look at getting to the zone, for example, I think you almost get the extremes happening in the team sport where it's either really easy or really hard to get into that zone. And we look at the really hard portion because you look at in a dressing room and the music that's being played in a dressing room. Well, if that's not sort of part of the music you want to listen to as part of your routine, that could really mess you up trying to get into your pregame routine, trying to get into that flow zone. So you don't have as much control over some of those variables. But if you have that camaraderie with your team, you have that leadership and you are all on sort of the same page, well, then just creating that flow state becomes so much easier. Whereas I think where individual sports, it's a little bit more controllable. So you don't quite have the big extremes, but you have to be willing to sort of wade within that middle ground. So there's Ryan always said, I think it can go both ways. And so it really just depends. It's again, comes back to the awareness of what you need as an athlete to be contributing to your teammate or contribute to your own performance. What really factors do you need to have that you can have control over? Do you have to impact to lead to that positive outcome?
I think the one thing too, you kind of mentioned the team setting versus individual. So from a skating and skill development standpoint, where I'm coming from, it's no different, right? You go with a team of 15 players and you're going to have some players that are going to buy in, some players aren't going to buy in. But if you have the coach bought into what you teach, then all of a sudden you get the report from the coach, and the coach will kind of help guide that process from the on-ice standpoint. And you see a huge difference when you have a coach that truly believes what you're doing is making a difference versus one that's on the fence about it. So
yeah, and I like what Ryan said about just that leadership group, because I think the same thing. If you can get that leadership group in the team to buy in, then life becomes really easy, as long as that leadership, right, is a healthy leadership for that team, where people are respecting that leadership. I've also worked with teams where that wasn't the case, and so trying to get the leadership team to buy in actually made things harder for the remainder of the group. So there's all these different dynamics. So I definitely think from an application standpoint, from professionally, it can be more difficult to incorporate that. And that's why I think such a, you have to tip your hats to coaches, because they have such a hard job trying to manage all these different players, and that no one's going to fit into just this one, typical role that maybe in olden days we expected everybody to be, in this idea that we couldn't be a player's coach, that you had to follow this norm. That's not what will get the best out of your team.
Perfect. Anything to add, Ryan?
No, I think we covered it. This is a short little call, but we could probably go on for hours and hours. But I think we covered a lot of ground, just specifically right now in the kind of the setting we're all in, and some simple strategies athletes can incorporate or look up or talk to us further about.
Perfect. All right. Thank you guys for hopping on, and hopefully everyone's back to whatever the new normal is going to be here soon. Hopefully for me, it means finding a sheet of ice that's cold, and we'll go from there. All right. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. See you, Nick.
See you later. Bye-bye, guys.